Interesting discussion. The book that I'll be looking at today, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, is a fairly lengthy work and contains a sweeping vision of 13.5 billion years of history. Contains a lot of details, a lot of thought-provoking ideas. And I thought long and hard about exactly how to structure what I wanted to get through this evening. It's clearly not possible to cover every idea that he raises and every thought that he puts forward. And equally, in a forum like this, to give a very nitty-gritty review with lots of referencing of sources and line-by-line readings also doesn't work. So what I thought I'd do is try and focus on three sections, and then hopefully leave a significant amount of time for questions and answers. And the first thing I wanted to look at was the age of the universe and evolution, that part of what he speaks about. The second thing I wanted to look at was some details and specifics, more just whizzing through several examples of some of the ideas he put forward and the claims he makes. And then finally, look at some of his thoughts about purpose and meaning, free will, moral values, consciousness, and the sort of reductionist approach that he takes to all of that. And then, as I said, leave time afterwards for questions. I'm not going to take questions during the presentation just because I want to be able to get through some of the material, but afterwards I'll definitely be here as long as possible and try and make as much time available for this. I also didn't produce source sheets. I decided that the discussion would sort of flow better if this was just done in abstract, and as a result, I'm not going to be able to prove or reference everything I say, but I'm definitely happy to share afterwards with anyone who wants more points and references, both within Torah sources and some of the academic literature that I cite. Now, the nature of a review, particularly this one, is that invariably it focuses more on the critical elements of the review, on some of the problems that I think the book raises, rather than on the positives. And therefore, just to set the tone and the context, I don't want to say that this is definitely a thought-provoking book. It presents a sweeping vision, perhaps too sweeping a vision of 13.5 billion years. He takes a contrarian viewpoint. And Harari, the author of this book, doesn't fit any of the sort of boxes that we often like labeling people with. He's as critical of some of liberal humanism and the ideas behind that as he is of other more traditional approaches. For him, religion often is a set of ideas and hanging them on some sort of superhuman or absolute entity, and he believes that liberal humanism has the same flaw, in which it believes in, he says modern liberal culture is also a religion. It doesn't deny the existence of a God because it worships humanity, and he believes there's as much problem in that as there is in the more traditional views. And he's also very open and thought-provoking about some of the challenges of modernity, the collapse of the family, the social evolution that we're really living through, and some of the breakdown in human well-being caused by the loss of, in his view, consolation that religion offers. So it's definitely a work that challenges many assumptions. He's quite open about the flourishing of modern-day science and philosophy, which often couldn't have come about, as he says, without empire and capital of the European powers, and he's not black and white in terms of areas which are often deplored by modern thinkers. And he recognizes that a lot of science and scientific research only flourished with an alliance between religion and ideology. So he's not, in that sense, he is presenting a nuanced picture. And it definitely is a work that's designed to make us think about what we mean by happiness, our search for meaning, the quest for immortality, which, as he says, has become a lot of the modern endeavor of science, makes us think more carefully about what the consequences of some of these journeys could be. It's a thought-provoking odyssey, really, through human history. And in seeking to understand what makes Homo, a human being, humankind, into sapiens, into wise beings, that's definitely a search that all of us should share in. What does it mean to be a wise human as opposed to just a human? But first, the big question that everyone has been asking for the last days: is it sapiens or sapiens? Well, the answer is, in British English, it's sapiens. In American English, it's sapiens. I will be referring to it as sapiens. This takeover of our culture by Americanisms and the invasion by red squirrels and by sapiens rather than sapiens is clearly an enormous problem, and please forgive me, I will be talking about sapiens. You are welcome to refer to sapiens if you so wish. So Yuval Noah Harari, born in 1976, a junior professor at the time in the Hebrew University, who wrote this work initially in Hebrew in 2011, translated into English actually initially for the British market, for the UK market in 2014, rejected 25 times by American publishers, and then eventually spotted by the American market and praised by Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and Barack Obama, made an enormous hit. And it's in the genre of big history, presenting this sweeping picture of big history. And it opens really by presenting history as a series of revolutions. It says, universe 13.5 billion years old, started with the explosion of time and space 13.5 billion years ago, that we refer to often as the Big Bang. Homo sapiens, our own species of apes, about 150,000 years ago. Only about 6% of the genus Homo, which has existed for about 2.5 million years. And he attempts to present in the 400-odd pages of the book a history, particularly of Homo sapiens, this particularly interesting branch of humankind, human beings, that appeared fairly recently. And his basic outline is that for the first half of our existence, the first 70,000 odd years, we potter along fairly unremarkably and boringly. And then about 70,000 years ago, there's this cognitive revolution. There's this, we start to suddenly begin behaving in far more ingenious manner than before, and spread rapidly across the planet. That's revolution number one. About 11,000 years ago, revolution number two, the agricultural revolution, in which we convert lands which had been used for hunting and gathering, foraging, forest lands and so on, into farming. The scientific revolution about 500 years ago. The industrial revolution about 250 years ago. The information revolution about 50 years ago. And then he talks a little bit about some of the biotech revolution that's occurring in literally as we speak, and predicts where this will go in some sort of merging between machine and human, and bioengineered post-human intelligent life, and amortal, non-mortal cyborgs capable of living forever. And he discusses all of this in his 400 pages, along with other momentous events in human history, the development of language, the thought about abstract matter, the institutions that we build as humans to create community and science, and everything that we do, the evolution of money, the evolution of religion, the rise of religion, the overpowering of polytheistic religions by monotheistic religions, the development of empire, trade, credit, and the rise of capitalism. So all of this is spoken about in this very large scale work. The first thing I really want to talk about is the first part of the book, before we approach the last 70,000 years, starting from the cognitive revolution and onwards. And this is his presentation about the age of the universe, 13.5 billion years, the evolution which brought about the wide variety of life forms that we see to this day. And I'd like to look at that from a little bit of a Torah perspective. Is this a challenge to us? Is this something that we need to be aware of or not? Now, what I'm going to say really very briefly is thoughts that I've developed more fully in a series that I gave on evolution and the age of the universe. For those who are interested in this, I did this for a series of Wednesday nights, and the recordings I'm happy to share. It's about 15 hours worth on the topic. But this is just a few short thoughts on the matter. And the first thing to say is that the current scientific understanding of the universe within which we live, which is a universe that started at a particular point, I was going to say a point in time and space, but actually it's a point at which time and space itself came into existence. That itself is a fairly recent view. If we look at 2,500 years or even 3,000 years of human thought, if one was a Jew standing in the year 1900 and maintaining the belief that the universe within which we live has only existed for a finite amount of time, that the universe within which we live isn't an eternal universe, and one maintained this position in the year 1900, one would be arguing with the best of human thought for about 3,000 years. Ever since the time of Plato and onwards, the assumption of all educated, thinking, philosophically inclined humans, not those who are submitting to the tenets of faith, but those who are following the consensus view of Greek thought was that we lived in an eternal universe, in a universe that was infinitely old, that had always existed. And to be a Jew meant that one was picking a fight with that orthodoxy, an orthodoxy that was well established. If someone would have turned, a Jew would have turned to the critic of this view, said, look, this is what I believe, and I'm sure that this is, that scientific and philosophical thought will come round to this understanding. They said, look, for 2,000 years, it hasn't come round to this understanding, 2,500 years. Why should it change now? Why should we think that something that's been accepted by the greatest minds for so long will adopt an alternative viewpoint? Fast forward 1906, and I deliberately chose the year 1900, 1906, the beginning of the development of Einstein and his theories of relativity. As things unfold, one of the implications spotted by those who are taking seriously what he is saying is that perhaps we live in an expanding universe. If we live in an expanding universe, and we see the universe as like this expanding outwards, then turning the clock back, we can look at the universe ever shrinking inwards as we get earlier in time, which would seem to suggest that it comes from a single point in time and space, which has become known as the Big Bang. Famously, Einstein himself was uncomfortable with this conclusion, rejected it, tried to change the maths a little by inventing a universal constant to cancel out the expansion of the universe. But from the 1960s and on, this has become fairly well established that we live in an expanding universe. A couple of points just to make about this. The first is that at this point in time, I'm following Harari's thought and the current scientific thinking. It's by no means true to say that every physicist thinks this is correct, but this is certainly the consensus of scientific thinking. And the dating of this 13.5 billion odd years, which is in flux somewhere between 13 and 15 billion years, but this dating of the time is basically worked out by turning the clock back. The maths is complicated, far too complicated for me. If one looks at the rate of expansion and turns the clock back, it would seem that extrapolating back in time, it started off at this point in time and space. Point number one. Point number two is we're not just talking about an explosion of space outwards. So picture this as we often do, as a large room, and matter is at one point and then begins expanding outwards. It's to misunderstand what we're saying. We're talking not just about matter expanding into space, but space itself expanding. So not matter expanding into pre-existing space, there's a space expanding, space itself expanding. These are difficult ideas to grasp, because intuitively we want to ask, what is space expanding into? But nonetheless, this is the current scientific understanding, that space itself is expanding. That means to say that space came into existence at this singularity that we call the Big Bang, and indeed time also came into existence at that point. So if we're tempted to ask what happens before this moment of the Big Bang, we've misunderstood the concept. It's not that there was a before, there was no time before, it's time and space have come into existence. And in this context, we're actually in a pretty good state, meaning to say that the traditional Jewish understanding, both in the philosophically inclined Rishonim and the Kabbalists, fits this model. We happen to be in a time in which the current scientific understanding fits very well our understanding. We've argued ever since Matan Torah and before that the universe wasn't eternal and came into existence at a particular point in time and space. And at least as of 2020, scientific understanding has come round to that point of view. We don't live in an eternal universe. We live in a universe at which time and space itself came into existence. And therefore, were we to try and think about what caused it to come into existence, the sort of answer that we're going to have to give is something above time and space, rather than something within time and space. It's a singularity. It's referred to as a singularity. It's a point where mathematical formulae break down. It's a point where scientific explanations of cause and effect break down, because by definition, there isn't a before. There's a breakdown almost in human language. There isn't a before. There isn't a space within which this occurs, and there isn't a time within which this occurs, and therefore the sort of causes that we could be looking for aren't going to be scientific causes, at least as science is currently understood. They're going to be causes that are above time and space. And again, this certainly is reminiscent of some of the thinking, all of the thinking really, of classical Judaism. So the core idea of a world that has moved, a scientific world, that has moved to acceptance of a finite universe, a universe that starts with a Big Bang, with a singularity, with a coming into existence of time and space, caused by something, as much as we can talk about causes above time and space, beyond time and space, is not and shouldn't be seen as foreign to our way of thinking. Certainly different to the traditional understanding, perhaps, of what we've said, is the length of time involved. Traditional understanding talks about 6,000 years. This current understanding talks about 13.8 billion years. The difference between 6,000 and 13.8, I should point out, it's an infinitely better approximation than infinite and 13.8 billion years. So in that sense, as long as we're in the same ballpark. We're talking about length of time. And it's well known that understanding the length of time that the Torah ascribes, particularly to the 6 days of creation, is not at all clear-cut. The length of day, which clock is used to measure these 6 days, Vayihi Erev, Vayihi Boker, we talk about evening and morning in a world which by the Torah's own description is pre the existence and creation of the sun. Which clock is used to measure the passage of time is not at all explicit in the Torah, but certainly the clock that's used is not that of sunrise and sunset, because there is no sunrise and sunset, and therefore no particular reason to think the length of time measured is referring to 24 hours. Is one way of thinking about these ideas. There's midrashim, Kabbalistic sources that talk about Hashem creating and destroying worlds, which may also be referring to something connected with this. There's an essay of Rabbi Kaplan that I can share with anyone, in which he makes calculations of time based on that. The Rambam in Mo Nevuchim says that the 6 days of creation aren't referring at all to periods of time. They're stages in creation, and the best way we have to think of this is periods of activity and inactivity in terms of conceptual stages, but they're not meant to be thought of as periods of time at all. Remarkably, Tosfos from the Chachmi Ashkenaz, the Rishonim in North Germany and in Germany and North France, thinks that the whole first chapter of Bereshis is a conceptual chapter. It's not describing the creation of the world at all. He says it's creation of the world of Olah b'machshava, the architectural plan of the creation of the world, rather than the actual creation of the world. As is well known, the first 2 chapters of Bereshis seem to tell the story of the creation of the world twice. Chapter 1 of Bereshis and chapter 2 of Bereshis. The first chapter talks about 6 days of creation. Second chapter just tells us a very brief description that God brought into existence everything that exists and the whole creation of humanity, and doesn't go through the 6-day system. And Tosfos, at least, is of the view that the first chapter is a plan of creation, Olah b'machshava, whatever exactly that means, God's thought process, and the second chapter is the actual literal description of the creation of the world, in which case the whole idea of 6 days, according to Tosfos, is certainly meant to be understood more conceptually than we often do. Rashi, again, a Rashi that I haven't really seen quoted often, in the first pasuk of the Torah, talks about Ein Mukdam u'Me'ucher b'Torah, famous theme of Rashi in his commentary on the Torah, that we can't always expect the Torah to follow temporal ordering in time. The Torah will often follow conceptual ordering. All books have this. Many books have a scene described, and then there will be a flashback, and then it will give some background information, and then the story will carry on. Rashi in his commentary on the Torah learns the Torah like that, and he says the same even regarding the very opening verses of the Torah. Rashi says even there, this isn't meant to be a temporal description, ein mukdam u'me'ucher b'Torah. And Rashi also there points out that the Torah isn't really about telling us scientific fact. It's not about telling us history. It's more interested in telling us what we ought to be rather than what is. So this is just a very brief overview of some of the ideas connected with the age of the universe. I'm not standing here claiming that I have enough scientific knowledge to agree or disagree with a particular perspective. I'm simply saying that if our insight into science leads us to adopt this position, I think there's enough in sources about the age of the universe that mean that we don't need to be concerned about this. There's enough in classic sources that always, long before the scientific revolution, took these opening chapters of Bereshis within a context rather than just reading them as a description of 6 literal days. And indeed, if we ask ourselves, what would we want the opening verse of Bereshis to sound like? Well, in 2020, it would perhaps say in the beginning there was a Big Bang, and then there was plasma, and then the plasma broke down into particles and eventually coalesced into subatomic particles, which combined into atomic particles, and then helium atoms combined to produce stars. And that maybe would read well in 2020. But it wouldn't have read well in 1920 and 1820 and 1720, when no one even knew what the word plasma meant. And presumably it wouldn't read well in 2120 and 2220. And if the Torah is there setting out anything beyond a sort of conceptual view of what we need to understand about creation, about what we ought to be as opposed to what we are, then this is going to be a challenge in any way in reading the first Pesukim of the Torah. So these are just some thoughts about age of the universe. In terms of evolution, again, the science and the maths is complicated. There are still areas that aren't understood, and very often the maths is way beyond our ability to calculate at the moment. Isn't there a genetic and evolutionary advantage in aging and dying? Current understanding of aging and dying is that this isn't simply wear and tear. This is built into the genetic structure of human beings, that we age and die. Why exactly is that of genetic advantage? Not clearly understood. Sexual versus asexual reproduction, whether there's a survival advantage in having to waste an enormous amounts of energy and resources on mating, on male meeting female and reproducing in that manner, as opposed to asexual reproduction, in which reproduction takes place without that. Again, the math is very complicated to understand whether evolution can justify that in terms of evolutionary advantage. There is an advantage, mixing of the genes. There's a disadvantage in terms of the enormous expenditure wasted on this. I think any scientifically minded reader understands that the claims of evolution are still very much a work in progress. Nonetheless, it again is not something that need be particularly foreign or difficult for us as readers of the Torah. The first point to mention is that evolution is not a theory about the origin of life. It's a theory about the origin of the diversity of life, of species, of where you get the diversity of life. Once you have a life form or reproducing a gene or DNA that reproduces itself, that copies itself, and copies itself with copying errors, and then needs to survive in a certain environment, the theory of evolution argues that diverse environments will give competitive advantages to different genetic combinations, and therefore over time diversity will increase. Certain of the copying errors will give a survival advantage, and you will end up with the diversification of species. It's not a theory about the origin of life, it's a theory about the diversity of life. And interestingly, in the language of the Torah has two words for creation. It uses the word bria, creation, which is normally translated as creation of something out of nothing, a complete innovative staging creation, and Cicero, which is forming and molding something which already exists into something else. And the Torah really only uses the word bria for the first creation of the universe, Bereshit bara Elokim, in the beginning Hashem created, the beginning of time and space coming into existence, and then it uses the word bria for the creation of life, and finally for the creation of humanity. Within that, the diversity of species, the Torah doesn't use the word bria, on the contrary it uses the word Yetzirah, leading to a reasonable suggestion that the diversity of life may merely have been an adaptation and a moulding of life, as opposed to the coming of life into existence, which is that of bria itself. Within the language of the Torah, and this is already picked up by the Rishonim, the Torah doesn't quite tell us the way we think the story goes. The Torah doesn't just say that Hashem said, let this life form pop into existence. Very often he spoke about life form emerging from pre-existing matter. So for example, in Bereshit, Pasuk 20, Hashem says, Yishut Amayim, let the waters swarm with a swarm of living things. In Pasuk 24, it says, Totzei ha'oretz nefesh chaya lemina, let the earth, let the grounds bring out living life forms, which may well mean that this is something within the properties of the earth, that it can bring out living life forms, as opposed to just being created beyond that. The Pasuk also says, a very famous Pasuk, when it comes to the creation of humanity, Vayom Elokim na'aseh Adam, let us make man, on which the Ramban and the Sifano, in different forms, comment that the us, let us make man, seem to imply a partnership in which the pre-existing creations participate, the pre-existing life forms participate and contribute that of themselves, and then something additional, a element of divinity and intelligence and Selam and Akim is added to this. And then the Ramban speaks about language which really is not far off the idea that there was that a human being, the Safana also a human being may have existed in some form in which they were savage and unintelligent, and something of divinity is added to the person. The idea, actually, that a human being has origins which are lower than that of spiritual life, the idea that we are a blend, and an interesting and complicated blend of that which is physical and material and that which is spiritual, of course, is not a new idea. We know that we have within ourselves that which is animalistic, and we have within ourselves the potential to be spiritual and elevated above that. And therefore, the idea that the creation of humanity came about through a partnership between the two isn't an idea that need be frightening or threatening to us. If one wants sources in more recent times, Rav Kook has a series of letters around the idea of evolution, and he finds in it a very beautiful idea. He finds in it the idea that everything evolves and ascends, and we live in a world in which life becomes ever more developed and perfect. He sees this as very much in accordance with our view of history moving forward and progressing, and the idea that we are hopefully heading to a perfected world from a world which is imperfect. We believe that we exist in a world which is imperfect, and which our responsibility is to partner with Hashem in perfecting it. He doesn't see a problem in what appears to be chance being used by Hashem to direct the development of the world. The theme of much of Jewish thinking is around this idea, the idea of Purim, the festival of chance, and yet one which is used to create and set up a system. And he also references that whenever we say someone makes something, if we say, he brings the posuk, when it says Solomon, Shlomo made the temple, it doesn't mean he literally built it with his own hands. It means he set up a system which would lead to the building of the first Beis HaMikdash. And similarly says when we talk about Hashem creating the world and creating and bringing into existence life forms, that may well have been through a system that was set up. Samson Raphael Hirsch points out that, again, behind the ideas of evolution, ideas which very much accord with our way of thinking. The idea that, really, the essence of monotheism is the idea that a world that looks very diverse and very different, and seems to have in it lots of discrete energies and powers and forces, actually has an overarching theme which is unified, is the essence of the leap that was made from polytheism, which sees all the forces as having their own independent existence, to monotheism, which sees a unified force behind it all. And in many respects, this is what's happened in evolution, in which we've learnt to understand that actually the very diverse forms of life all develop from the single creation and bringing into existence of life. So the idea that diversity can emerge from that which is unified from unity is really, again, at the heart of our picture of life, and therefore, again, not something that we need to be frightened of. And Rav Soloveitchik, in a series of lectures, also addressed this issue. And again, he said that the idea that of evolution, the age of the universe, this is nothing. This isn't stuff to be worried about at all. He says the real problem, which is irreconcilable, is if one thinks that the idea of man emerging from that which is animal somehow contradicts the concept of man as the bearer of a divine image. So that's where things get different. If we want to draw conclusions about the nature of man, and think that our origins from animals means that we are irrevocably, irreparably animalistic and are incapable of carrying within ourselves the divine morality and purpose, that's where things get dangerous. And again, more than that, he doesn't see, and he references the Rambam and some of the other sources we've spoken about, who view creation in terms of phases rather than particular periods of time. So I think there's sufficient within traditional Jewish understanding that wouldn't really take issue with many of the claims made in the first part of Harari's books. And again, each person has to form their own understanding and judgment of science to estimate where the scientific evidence is up to in these respects. But in principle, this isn't a challenge. What I want to do now is speak for a little bit of time and run through many of the many other facts that he mentions, and argue that the book is really marred by inaccuracies and errors. Sometimes an error in the sense that it's literally a factual mistake, sometimes in the sense that what he's claiming and just casually mentions as scientists believe or scholars believe, a phrase he uses a lot, in a work that really doesn't have many references and is very unreferenced, is actually not a consensus of scientific thinking, but is very debatable. Sometimes assumptions which aren't spelt out, in which he sort of begs the question, he assumes the very argument he's trying to make, and sometimes a philosophical confusion and a mixing of categories and leaps where actually the philosophical thought doesn't justify the claim that he is making. I want to really just look at a sample of several ideas in quite a fast-moving manner. And then finally, in the third part of this, focus particularly on his claims around morality, free will, consciousness, happiness, and the nature of what it means to be a human being. But for now, just for a few minutes, I want to comment, as I said, on just a sample of some of the things that he says, which I think are quite problematic. His training is as a historian of the medieval world, and I think there's a significant misunderstanding, actually, in the book about his understanding of the medieval world, the medieval church, and the scientific revolution. And again, I'm not going to give all references here, but anyone afterwards is welcome. I'm happy to email people more detailed references. He suggests on page 279 that the pre-modern world religion, asserted that everything important to know about the world was already known. And this is simply inaccurate, and certainly not true to our faith, and not true even to Christianity. It may be that these traditions asserted that everything that's essential to spiritual development, to salvation, to perfection of the human being, maybe that is already known, but certainly it didn't lay claim to revelation being the source of all knowledge. In our own tradition, in Torah, we have ideas, Chochma b'goyim tamin, Torah b'goyim al tamin. If you think in a non-Jewish world, Torah can be found. No, that's not correct. We are the bearers of Torah tradition. Chochma, wisdom, insight into understanding of how the world works, scientifically, medically, no problem at all. We don't claim that Torah is the source of these things at all. On the contrary, the halachic system dictates that we should follow the best scientific discoveries and insight, that we should consult a doctor, a researcher, to understand how medicine works when we need to make decisions about pikuach nefesh. The Rambam famously believed that we need to investigate the wisdom of the world. The Rambam was very heavily influenced by Greek, i.e. sources of information and philosophy outside Torah in order to understand how the world works. The claim that religion, pre-modern religions, thought that they were the authorities of everything is simply not correct and inaccurate. He doesn't mention in the book the Greek tradition. He doesn't mention Aristotle and its impact on the Christian church, who adopted, perhaps over-adopted, had over-respect for the thoughts of Aristotle, and certainly didn't think that their traditions had the source of all information. He even defines, interestingly, science in an inaccurate way. And he says that science has a common core of research methods which are based on collecting empirical observations, those we can observe with at least one of our senses, and putting them together with the help of mathematical tools. This is a completely outdated description of science. Anyone who knows the development of the understanding of science, I'm not even talking about Karl Popper, I'm talking about well beyond Karl Popper. It's gone so far from that. And the idea of science is actually is not collection of empirical evidence. That's maybe what the Greeks thought what science was. It's not what we understand science to mean. It's actually testing theories through experimentation in an attempt to disprove it, and so on. So even his description of science actually reveals a very basic flaw. And what I'm saying here is, I will tell you when I'm saying something controversial. What I'm saying now is not controversial. It's simply a misstatement of what science is about. He ignores the medieval era, the role of the monasteries and the friars in researching and independently researching. There were not church diktats about what they could look at, and what church diktats there were because of a reverence for Aristotle as a non-Christian source of information, rather than Christianity itself. Aquinas, he doesn't mention anything about Aquinas, who's one of the most brilliant minds, who wrote about ethics, who wrote about science, the church again adopted Aristotle and Aquinas as doctrinal. He doesn't mention, and he certainly doesn't mention Jewish sources about Chochma b'goyim tamin, Chacham chachmi u'masa'olam, the bracha that we make when we see a wise person who has wisdom beyond a Torah views. He speaks about a monolithic viewpoint, as if somehow religion means that one can only think about things in one way. In our own tradition, we have Shivim Panim LaTorah, we have Elu ve'elu Tevidikim Chaim, sources that date back well before the modern era. We're talking about Talmudic sources from 2,000 years ago. The idea of debate being essential to arriving at truth. The Gemara, Oy chavrusa, oy misusa. Either you have a study and debating partner or death. There's no way of arriving at truth without debate. The Gemara that describes the nature of debate as mitachilon nasu oivim zer. All true debate involves a clash and a disagreement. The Gemara uses the word of enmity, and eventually ends in, in the end, there's a love that develops between those that debate, because they both share the love and the search for truth. Within the Christian tradition, which again he doesn't mention, many scholastic thinkers from the 1100s, 1200s were very aware of the idea that a single authority isn't enough to establish truth, that disputation is required to train the mind. Peter Abelard, who died in 1142, is just one example of a medieval philosopher who was aware of this. This was absolutely clear in the medieval era. This is just inaccurate presentation of medieval thought. He speaks about certainty, and I'll get onto some of the claims he makes with great certainty. But he says actually that a feature of the modern mind is that we don't have certainty. And he refers to a fellow called Vespucci, Amerigo Vespucci. Anyone aware who he was? The person who gave the name, an Italian sailor, whose name was used to give the American continent its name. And he says he's the first modern man because he had the courage to say we don't know. I mean, this is outrageous. The medieval documentation, Greek philosophers, just thinking are full of the ideas of we don't know. The Gemara in Brachos, La'olam yargel odom l'shono lo me'eni yodea. A person should practice saying they don't know because there's so much that we don't know about life. In the Christian tradition, John of Salisbury, English, 1180, died in the 1180s. Again, he rejected the whole concept of dogmatic truth, spoke about probable truth that needs to be constantly reevaluated and revised. Cicero, going back to, died 43 BC, Roman statesman, orator, lawyer, philosopher who said the same thing. So these are, again, sources that are absolutely in the ancient world they were very aware of, and the idea that somehow this is the first modern man because he had the bravery to say he doesn't know is simply a historical inaccuracy. He makes this claim, actually, if we're mentioning Amerigo Vespucci, he makes this claim that Columbus's contact with the New World was a turning point, the foundational event of the scientific revolution. He says that the discovery of new continents taught Europeans to favor present observations over past traditions. He says the Romans, the Mongols, the Aztecs conquer new lands in search of power and wealth, not of knowledge. In contrast, European imperialists set out to distant shores in the hope of obtaining new knowledge along with new territories. What evidence does he provide for this claim that the discovery of America was a seminal event in the scientific revolution? Not a drop. He just says it as a statement. I couldn't find in the references a single historian. It's a claim, it's a thought. But where does he get this evidence from? In fact, was the start of the scientific revolution dated to the discovery of America? Was there a scientific revolution? Or was it actually a long process? The idea of this sort of medieval dark ages and a scientific revolution that started in the 1500s is completely outdated now. We talk about the Renaissance, the 1200s as the start of Renaissance. There's recognition that Occam's razor, Occam, and recognition of Aquinas and the groundwork that was laid by the Greek philosophers. The idea that there's a scientific revolution that somehow started in the 1500s is no evidence for that, and certainly that Columbus's discovery of America was important in that. No evidence of this. Equally problematic is claim that the Europeans were exceptional for their ambition to explore and conquer. He says the Chinese never attempted to conquer Indonesia or Africa. Most Chinese rulers left even nearby Japan to its own devices. Did most French rulers leave nearby England to its own devices? Absolutely, statistical fact. So what does this claim mean that most Chinese emperors left Japan to its own devices? Some Chinese emperors, a minority, tried to conquer Japan, and most didn't. Like most of mainland European governments didn't try and conquer England, which is the islands off it. Famously, between 1405 and 1433, the Chinese admiral Zheng He set off on 7 voyages of discovery. And the idea that there was somehow something different about Chinese culture that meant that it didn't have an interest in exploring the world is inaccurate. There were political forces and financial forces at work, which led to China falling behind in the race for knowledge. But the idea that this was the start of the scientific era was the first time that humans possessed curiosity about things they didn't know, and until then they thought they knew everything, is simply a myth. Mongols promoted the study of medicine and astrology, set up thousands of schools. Aztec science, interestingly, how much do we know about Aztec science? Very little, because it was destroyed by the curious Europeans when they conquered that area, and they burnt the great libraries of the Aztecs. So this idea that pre-medieval Europe, and that somehow this is a scientific revolution, is simply inaccurate. The Birth of Monotheism. He devotes 6 lines to discussing the birth of monotheism, and he says, in his talk about the birth of monotheism, with time, some followers of the polytheist gods became so fond of their particular patron that they drifted away from the basic polytheist insight. They began to believe that their god was the only god, and that he was in fact the supreme power of the universe. And so he goes on. So he says, monotheism evolves simply from followers become dedicated to their particular god, and they decide to choose him as the only power. Any evidence for this claim? He doesn't present any. Amateurish speculation, that's what it is. Axial age, he doesn't mention a word about the axial age. An enormous flourishing of human civilization in which in every society across the world, belief in monotheism began rising, a time of instability, a time of warfare, a time of increased commerce, the appearance of coinage, urbanization. Nothing mentioned about that. And the same development that occurred around the same era in history in which great thinkers, philosophers, prophets, each society in its own way, began thinking about trying to find a more transcendental and universal way of understanding life, of which monotheism was part of that search, trying to rise above the limitations of the parochial and the limited of their own society. And again, no single mention of that. And it's very well recognized that the emergence of a cosmic order was something that occurred across different societies. So for us Jews, the concept of a cosmic order came out as monotheism. For the Greeks, it came out for a search for the philosophical and rational basis of science. And certainly that partnership was crucial to the ability of humans to begin trying to make sense at a deep level with this idea that there's a unified system at work behind it, which allows science to develop. Most historians think that had humanity not passed or gone through a theological age, an age of trying to find system and order, science couldn't have developed, and that development of the insight and axial age is what led to a sense of shared humanity in many societies and the emergence of general scientific laws, again completely unmentioned by Harari in this very distorted view of history. And then he sort of, again, just begs the question. In one remarkable line, he says, Christianity took over the mighty Roman Empire in one of history's strangest twists. Now, it is one of history's strangest twists, but perhaps one explanation that could be offered is that something in it, in monotheism, actually spoke to human beings. Something, and it wasn't just the parochial rise of belief in one God and preference of one God over others, but actually offered people a sense of that which is true and that which was meaningful. But he doesn't consider that possibility. He makes philosophical jumps, and maybe some of this is hitting closer to home. His whole assumption is that humankind is a product of accidental evolutionary forces. And that means, he argues, that there can't be any intentionality in history. But he begs the question. It's an assumption that he adopts and therefore draws conclusions from. Since everything is a product of random chance and there can't be intentionality in history, therefore humanity is cut adrift in a lonely planet, a drifting galaxy in a dying universe. Humanity is nothing but a biological entity. Human consciousness is not a reflection of the divine mind in any way. And basically the assumption is that since humans emerged from this sort of bloody and violent history of warfare and conquest of the Neanderthals, therefore therefore there can't be anything in them which means that God has a particular plan or purpose for human beings. Now I'm not here setting out to prove whether God does or doesn't have a hand in or a purpose for human beings, but a human being would appear to face a choice whether to be a Mozart, a Moshe, or Michelangelo, or whether to be a Hannibal or a Hitler. It would appear that human beings have the choice to make moral decisions, and the idea that perhaps because we emerged and are genetically not that different from glorified apes, as he says, that somehow predetermines our nature is simply a philosophical leap that is inaccurate. He says that we are members of a large and particularly noisy family called the Great Apes. He refers to that as that used to be one of history's most closely guarded secrets. Who was guarding the secret? What's this conspiracy that he's alluding to? That somehow the fact that we are members of the ape family is a secret. One can even ask, are the apes particularly noisy animals compared to other animals? There's these sort of asides that he drops into the language that he uses constantly, which is very difficult to understand. He says we're embarrassingly similar to chimpanzees, Our societies are built from the same building blocks as chimpanzee societies. Because our genetic structure only differs slightly from that of chimpanzees, that tells us something about our essential nature. It doesn't tell us anything about our essential nature. The nature of genetic code is that it doesn't map directly onto... Genetic code shouldn't be thought of as an architectural plan. It should be thought of as a set of instructions. Let me just give you an example. If you're following a recipe, and the recipe consists of 15 lines about the icing of the cake, and 2 lines about the body of the cake, the length of the instruction doesn't tell you anything about the ratio of the components in the recipe. And it doesn't tell you that the icing of the cake is more or less important than the cake itself, just because if you have an architectural plan, a map, and you see something taking up a significant amount of space on the map, then in real life it takes up a significant amount of space. But in genetic instruction, it's more like a recipe than a map. And the percentage of similarity tells us nothing about how actually we operate. In fact, to the best of my limited research, the latest really full-scale study on the similarity between ape society and human society was conducted in 2009 by Thomas Ello, and actually argues that there's no similarity between the structures of the society at all. I'm not here trying to take a stance on some things which are above my competence. I'm not here claiming that ape society is similar or isn't similar to human society. I'm simply saying he asserts this without referencing claims or evidence for this, and doesn't acknowledge that these are matters which are very much in flux and in debate amongst the scientific world at the moment. All I'm saying is when we read these claims, we need to do our own research. And it's so easy now with a little bit of Googling to get hold of some of the documentation and simply check. Just because a writer writes with great confidence something that they take for granted, and especially when it's a sort of semi-academic work which doesn't give references but presents claims as coming from scientists and scholars and thinkers, one needs to check whether these are accurate. I don't know enough about human society or ape society to form a judgment. I simply know that that the research out there also doesn't know. This simply remains a matter of debate. He talks about the cognitive revolution, and maybe with this I'll finish the fast-moving fast, and we'll try and look in more detail at a couple more topics. He talks about the cognitive revolution starting 70,000 years ago. He says this led to a massive sparking of insight into human creativity and ingenuity, and a flourishing of human society and technological abilities and other such things, language and ability to communicate, and we'll come on to this later, ability to construct fiction and imagination in order to build the structures of society, whether they're religion, whether they're states, whether it's money, whether it's credit, whether it's business companies. And he discusses what led to this cognitive revolution, and he says it's some sort of mutation which altered the inner wirings of our brain, allowing us to communicate using an altogether type of language. He says the most commonly believed theory argues that this is accidental genetic mutations. Why did it occur in sapiens DNA? It was a matter of pure chance as far as we can tell. Now one needs to unpick every word of that sentence. What is the evidence for cognitive revolution? Is it true that there's evidence that there was a sudden change in human cognitive ability? Do we have evidence that this didn't take place over several thousand years? Again, many studies seem to believe that the whole concept is wrong, and this wasn't a revolution, but this was new behaviors that turned up in place, separated by geography, by space and time before this turned up. The development of language may have been something that took place over millennia. Again, the claim that this occurred in one go, not evidenced for. Similarly, the claim that this was caused by some change, a mutation in the brain, in the genetic hardwiring of the brain, no evidence presented for this. The claim that this happens by chance, obviously no evidence presented of this because it's not the sort of thing that one could find evidence for. So in that sentence, a very key part of his claim about the cognitive revolution, there isn't evidence that this occurred in one go, and there isn't evidence for the theory that this was a genetic change. It may have been something else other than a genetic change, like a cultural change, like the slow development of society, and the idea that it was a matter of pure chance as far as we can tell that it occurred in the DNA of Homo sapiens. It's not as far as we can tell. We have no reason to pick one side or another. What would allow us to adopt the premise, the assumption, that change in the brain of Homo sapiens was pure chance? Simply begging the question, an assumption that the only possible explanation of these things could be pure chance, therefore it must be that it was pure chance that led to the genetic changes, if they occurred, in the brains of Homo sapiens. So we have a claimed cognitive revolution, no evidence. a claim to genetic mutation as the cause of that, no evidence, and a claim that this change occurred due to pure chance, again, no evidence other than a set of assumptions that the only possible explanations of these sorts of changes can be that which is material and physical, because we're talking about a writer who adopts hook, line and sinker this sort of materialistic, reductionist worldview, which we're going to look at in more detail shortly. I'm only going to address very briefly his claims about fiction and imagination and the part it plays in human development. This is really one of his foundational ideas, that this is what lets humans leap ahead. Our ability as Homo sapiens to access fictional constructs, social constructs, is what allowed us to overcome other species and allows us to communicate in societies and groups beyond perhaps the limits of our brain power, which is maybe a contact with about 150 people. And what allows large number of strangers to cooperate is common myths. Now, this claim itself has been put forward by others, and is certainly a very interesting idea. And there's not particular evidence for it, but it's one that's often discussed, and it's a very, very thought-provoking idea. Not original to Harari, but one that is is thought-provoking. However, it's interesting where he carries on from that, because he refers then to constructs, these sort of myths that are created. The idea of nationality, for example. There's nothing biological about nationality. It's something that we as a society buy into because it helps us structure in an orderly way how we coexist with each other. There's nothing fundamental about money. There's nothing that gives a pound coin intrinsic value. It's a social construct that as a society, if we adopt and we all buy into that convention, makes life convenient. He uses the example of companies, Peugeot. So Peugeot isn't a particular individual, it's a construct, a social construct, the idea that a commercial entity is treated in law as its own independent entity which can be sued in courts for damage that it does, which can achieve profits and losses. This again is a social construct, and he says any large-scale human cooperation, whether the modern state, whether the medieval church, ancient city or archaic tribe, is rooted in common myth. So far, so good. And then he carries on, yet none of these things exist outside the stories that people invent and tell one another. There are no gods in the universe, no nations, no money, no laws, and no justice outside the common imagination of human beings. So a leap has just happened there, from the idea that states and tribal structures and even money and companies are figments of human creativity and concepts that we construct in an act of fiction or imagination. When he uses the word fiction and imagination, he doesn't mean it in a negative sense. He's not saying this is a lie, but he's saying there's nothing intrinsic and fundamental. It's just a societal agreement to adopt these as models. And he leaps and makes a leap from that to the existence of no god or gods, and no laws and no justice outside the imagination of human beings. So in that step, he has now taken upon an assumption that morals are simply a construct, again, of human imagination. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this later, but the idea that something isn't tangible, the idea that something isn't material, and one wants to ask oneself, what sort of things does he think aren't the product of human imagination? Well, presumably things that can be touched and smelt and tasted and directly experienced by our senses. The idea of confusing anything which can't be directly touched and experienced by our senses as simply being a product of a human imagination is flawed. There isn't this leap from the idea that the concept of states or tribes or societies is an agreed upon social convention, to make the leap from that into the assumption that anything we can say about morality or justice is also just a figment of human imagination is unsubstantiated. No evidence for it, and we'll see shortly a lot of reasons to believe it's incorrect. And then one wants to ask oneself, what would he make of other concepts? Dark matter, subatomic particles. Please God, in a couple of days' time, I'll have the privilege of going to CERN, to the Hadron Collider there in CERN. I managed to wrangle my way onto a school physics trip, and I look very much forward to accompanying the trip and being able to see that in action. Would Harari agree with that, or is this also just a fiction and a construct of human imagination? Actually, what about Harari's own ideas? What about truth? Is truth also just a figment of human imagination, a social construct? Or does truth tell us something about the way the world really is? With anything that is a product of human thought, that isn't material, doesn't exist in the physical world, and he talks about this, he says rivers and lions and things that really exist, is a social construct, then the argument devours itself, it eats itself up. Much like a snake that eats its tail. Because if you're going to argue that abstract entities, abstract concepts like truth don't exist, then what does the sentence that they don't exist itself mean? And it's interesting, by the way, that he says that morals are simply a social contract, justice is a social contract, and yet an idea that runs through the book again and again and again. He speaks about the enormous damage we're doing to our environment. He says modern day industrialization is the largest crime in human history. What do you mean crime? This is simply a social construct. This is simply an invented concept. So it would seem that all moralities can be social constructs, other than moralities that he cares about, such as environmental damage. And again, this is revealing a mindset over here, which is actually we humans don't believe that morals are just social constructs. We don't accept, as he says remarkably in the book, that there isn't a difference between Hammurabi's Code and the American Declaration of Independence, other than a social construct of morality, other than a fiction that we have adopted. We don't believe that. We look at different opportunities, different decisions, and we say some are more moral and some are less moral. What about mathematics? That makes possible the very science that Harari is basing himself upon. That makes possible evolutionary biology as much as physics and other things. Maybe simple integers. Maybe because they're real live objects. You have 1 cup, 2 cups, 3 cups. But what about square roots and imaginary numbers and formulae and negative numbers for that matter? Where does a negative number exist? How does science operate if all of that, if you confuse the concept of that which isn't material and physical with whether something is real or fiction? And this is a philosophical muddle which he doesn't seem to be aware of at all. I'll leave just in the interest of time his thoughts about agricultural evolution and the human condition, happiness. He talks, I'll just say one comment that he makes. He dismisses the concept of meaning of life, really, on page 438 with a few lines. He says, from a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has absolutely no meaning. Our actions are not part of some divine cosmic plan. Now, the first half of the sentence is true. From a purely scientific viewpoint, human life has no meaning. Because science is the study of the what, not the why, and not purpose, and not morality. If you want to study morality, you need to turn to philosophy or to theology. But then he makes this leap, and he says, because from a purely scientific viewpoint, there's no, our actions, human life has absolutely no meaning, our actions are not part of some divine cosmic plan. The purely scientific viewpoint can say nothing about divine cosmic plans. I'm not arguing here for divine cosmic plans. I'm simply saying that his claim that somehow he's asserted there's no divine cosmic plan, again, is a shocking example of begging the question and making philosophical assumptions. Just to conclude with a couple more points that focusing a little bit more detail, there is a theme that underlines everything he's saying, and this is the philosophical concept of reductionism. And the thought behind reductionism is that everything about human behavior can be reduced to the particles or subatomic particles of which we are made up. And if we knew well enough just physics, if we knew well enough everything about the interaction of particles, we could explain everything that takes place in human experience and human history. So if you want to know why a picture is hung up on your wall, the answer is the laws of physics, because of the interaction between particles. If you want to know why you turned up here tonight, the answer is the laws of physics, because of the particles that make you up. And were we to have a computer complicated enough to work through all these laws of physics, then we would be able to explain all of this. Harari dismisses in 4 lines on page 458 any discussion about probably the most in-depth discussed philosophical issue in the history of Western thought, which is the relationship between the brain, our physical bodies, and mind and consciousness. Dismissed within 4 lines. He basically refers to it all the way through. His brain doesn't like even the word mind. What is the relationship between consciousness and the brain? We don't know. We have no idea. We don't know what it means to say that which is material and physical can somehow have experiences. All of us experience. We all are conscious. We're all aware beings. And yet we don't know how that which is physical gives rise to that. And after 3,000 years of philosophical thought about that, we still face basic confusions about the interaction between that which is material and physical and that which isn't material and physical, because that's consciousness itself. And in fact, consciousness itself, and this is already pointed out by Descartes, is the only thing that we directly experience. That which is physical and material, we can't ever perceive of itself. It's possible, it's illusion. But the experience of at least being fooled or being deluded, that experience is real. And yet all of this is dismissed by Harari. There's no discussion about whether matter gives rise to consciousness or whether matter mediates consciousness. We know that as our brains deteriorate, our minds also seem to interact with the world, deteriorate in the interaction with the world. Is that because consciousness is a product of physical matter, and as the physical matter declines, consciousness declines? Or is the better analogy, like were humans all to be born with goggles over their eyes? And if we noted that as the goggles get scratched and deteriorate, our vision would deteriorate, and we might think that it's the goggles that give rise to our ability to see. And we wouldn't believe someone who would tell us that if the goggles are removed from our eyes, we'd actually have clearer vision. So is the brain the interface between consciousness and the physical world? And as the brain deteriorates, it's merely the interface, the goggles, which is deteriorating? Or is it consciousness itself deteriorating? Not a word of any understanding of this sophistication. Basic to the history of Western thought and dismissed and not discussed by Harari. Obviously, he doesn't believe in the concept of a soul, the belief that every individual has a sacred inner nature, dismissed, because of course what would show that up in science? Morality, as I already mentioned, he is a moral relativist of an extreme sort, comparing the position of the Declaration of Independence, the Code of Hammurabi, distrusts that for no good reason and doesn't evidence what his distrust of morality is, what his basis for assuming that our moral sense doesn't reflect something real about the world. Our logical sense we assume reflects something real about the world. We assume, even though logic is unprovable, that it's axiomatic, and yet the same sort of strong sense of that which is axiomatic, which is moral, is dismissed, and doesn't seem to reflect that. Actually, all societies have coalesced around a similar sort of morality. In summary, because I do want to leave some time for questions, I think this is a book that, on many levels, asks us to pretend that we're not what we know ourselves to be on the most basic level. We know ourselves to be thinking and feeling subjects, moral agents who have a sense of morality, who have a sense of free will, social beings who genuinely are capable of interacting with each other. And I think he adopts a position of reductionism which asks us to believe that everything we know that is most fundamental about ourselves is untrue. Were that to be presented with evidence and with clear and careful and systematic philosophical thought, that would be very interesting. At the moment, though, it seems to me that it isn't and shouldn't be viewed as a serious contribution to knowledge. It's some form of wild intellectual ride, which is fascinating, thought-provoking, stimulating, and genuinely so, but I don't think provides us with a reliable source of information about the way the world is and what we should believe about the world. I'll stop there for now in terms of what I've said, but I definitely would like to open the floor to questions and thoughts and do my best to try and address some of them if anyone has anything to say on this matter. Yes?
Yes, well, thank you very much. It's brilliantly put across. One of the things that you started speaking about was creation, whether it was the Big Bang 13.5 billion years ago, or 6,000, or whichever date you want to come to. So I've never been able to answer, or in my own mind, whichever time you want to say. If somebody says there was a time, then what was before that time according to them? And you did answer and say, well, there's sort of things happened and such. But even if you answered his way of thinking, what was before that time?
We actually, in that sense, we're on the same page as current scientific thinking, which is both traditional Jewish sources, spelled out with the Rambam, the Vilna Gaon, and various other sources, and current scientific thinking is that one can't ask what happened before the creation of the world, because there was no time, there was no before. There's a breakdown in human language and human thought. And we ask ourselves, what was Hashem doing before the creation of the world? Why did he decide to create the world then and not then? The answer is, we can't use that language because there was no time that took place that was there before, and therefore the question isn't coherent. We really black back at the classic Jewish formulation that he is above time and space. Now, I don't know actually what that meant. Great thinkers like the Rambam and others speak about this. I don't know exactly how they conceived of it, but in the 21st century, whatever worldview one belongs to, one has no choice but to adopt that perspective. Because we ask ourselves that the universe is expanding, space is expanding. It means it's not stars expanding within space, it's space itself expanding. And one wants to scream out, what's it expanding into? Well, it must be expanding into some other form of space, and it isn't, as far as we currently understand. It's space itself expanding, time itself started, and therefore we can't ask what preceded the Big Bang if we mean by that temporally. There are cause and effects that can exist not in time. So we can ask what preceded it in the causal chain, what caused it, but we can't ask what preceded it in time. This distinction was already drawn by the Rambam in Mona V'chim. He points out that some causes can be concurrent with time. For example, if I'm holding down a spring, the cause of the spring staying down is my hand that's holding it down, but it doesn't precede it in time. Could be at some point I pushed it down, but now at this moment, the cause of it staying down is temporally parallel to it staying down. So we can ask what causes a Big Bang, and the answer will not be anything material. It will be something above time and space that can bring physical reality and time and space into existence. So we're in the same camp in a sense. Science has led us to recognize that the answer to this very profound question isn't going to be in what we currently understand science to mean, and that's a good place to be. It's not a bad time to be a Jew, 2020. Yes?
So there will be always, debate about whether, how long one day in the creation lasted,
yes.
etc. But I think there is no debate about Noah.
Yes.
So Noah happened 5,000 years ago.
Yes.
And there was a bottleneck in terms of evolution.
Yes.
Because there were 8 people.
I'm going to interrupt you very briefly. There's much that needs to be asked about Judaism, including Noah and the stories of Yetzias Mitzrayim and everything else. I'm very happy to do another session on it. Here I'm simply focusing on Harari's book. Now it's true Harari's first name is Noah, but beyond that, it's a separate topic. It's a vitally important topic and an interesting one.
It's important because you're saying we agree on the way we look.
In the interest of time, I'm simply going to stop there because there's a lot that needs to be asked about the archaeological evidence for Yetzias Mitzrayim, for the Mabul claim, how the time frame works. I have addressed some of these things in my Wednesday night show and recordings available. In the interest of this particular topic, I just want to stick to Harari's themes, and he doesn't address the flood and other things really in that sense, and therefore I'm going to put that on hold.
I read the book and I found it very interesting.
Yes.
And I felt that he as an author was actually fighting against himself with his Judaism, and there were things that were percolating.
Yes.
One of the things that particularly affected me was the idea of Homo sapien,
Yes.
and that was the first creature that had a consciousness.
Yes.
And it made me consider that as Adam.
Yes.
And the connection with that in the Torah. And the other thing which struck me was he said there were either two arguments, that one would be that previous life form had gone away, or that Homo sapien had basically reproduced with the existing life form.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me think about morality and maybe the genetics, that maybe in this day and age, you see terrible things in the world and people who behave in a very bad way, and whether there's a genetic following from the more animalistic creatures that are around.
So Harari's book definitely stimulates interesting thought, including much thought that is positive for how we view the world. And depending on what context one's reading the book, one can definitely read the book and say, oh, well, actually, this is there's much that he says that is very thought-provoking in terms of our own moral system and our own understanding of the universe. Having said that, he doesn't think that the cognitive revolution, as he terms it, is that about humans developing moral consciousness, because he believes that morality and consciousness is what he calls a fiction or imagination, and in a sense a social construct. We can definitely reinterpret it in our own terms, and a reasonable understanding of what perhaps we mean by Adam Harishon is the first spiritually sensitive human being, the first that seeks and looks for and achieves a relationship with the divine. That's certainly a possible reading of it. The second point you made is that our genes, our DNA, may contain DNA that has come into existence through fearful acts of violence and through interbreeding with human forms, that Neanderthals, about which we know very little, but may have been savages, may not, maybe they were culturally superior to humans, who knows. Again, I would simply say that this is an interesting thought, but we recognize very much in our system that we humans have the animalistic within ourselves, and that we share that which is, we share much similarity with animal lives. The idea that we are, on some level, particularly if we choose to be brothers and sisters with the animal world and with apes, is not a controversial idea. It is it's a classic Jewish idea. We simply make the claim that we possess free will and we are capable of rising above that. Now, free will is its own topic, and there's a lot of scientific research going into this on whether we can or cannot disprove free will. Again, Harari doesn't really touch on that in this book. He simply says it as a statement, and therefore in this particular talk I'm not going to go into in detail, but from my point of view there's no evidence to claim that we humans don't possess free will, each within our own perspective and our own abilities. So humans with different abilities and different DNA may face different range of choices, but we all face the possibilities of making choices. Yes?
Skipped over very quickly his rejection of the fact of there being a soul.
Yes.
Now, one of the interesting points when he talked about that is say, well, if there's a soul, at what point did the soul come into existence? Because
yes.
If you look at evolution, go back before Homo sapiens, whatever we emerged out of, they wouldn't have had a soul.
Yes.
So, how do you deal with that?
Yes. Again, we also think that humans achieved a soul at a certain stage. Now, if you look at the Midrashic literature, it says that was 6 hours into Adam's life, whatever 6 hours mean in the concept of Medrash. If you look in the Ramban seems to suggest that there were human beings walking around that appeared human-like, that didn't yet have a tselem and a kim, didn't yet have a spiritual consciousness. I'm happy to share the recordings when I look at this in detail, but just read the Psukim with a fresh eye, and the Psukim definitely seem to say that there was a human that existed, that by Yipach Ba'apam, that then breathed into them, was a tselem and a kim. So all we can say is, at some point, human beings crossed a threshold where their intelligence and cognitive ability and spiritual sensitivity was such that they were now able to relate to the divine, and had the divine within themselves such that they had a soul. We would identify that with the figure of Adam Harishon if we need to give a location and a time and a description of personality. What sort of scientific evidence could be found that would indicate when that transition happens? I don't know what we could look for in archaeological record. I don't know why we'd expect to be able to find anything about that. And his question about, well, when could it happen, is the same question, by the way, applies to all evolutionary theory. If we think about the development of species as a step by step, one can always ask the question, at what point did a parent give birth to a child to belong to another species? And the answer is never. We can look at 100 generational gap and say this is one species, this is another species, and this one can't anymore mate to this one, and therefore define it as, or is unlikely to, and therefore define it as a different species. But it's always by incremental steps. And there's no reason that spiritual nature should be any different to that. These things can develop incrementally, and at some point there's a crossing of a threshold, at which point it achieves... always, we human beings like seeing things digitally, on, off, and almost invariably in nature, it's a spectrum. We like to know when does life start, when does life end. And halacha and law has to give a cut-off point, a clear cut-off point. There's always incremental steps that take place as life starts, as life ends, and bit by bit the different parts of bodily function break down. We're always looking for digital on-off answers, and there's always incremental steps in nature. And at some point, one has to make a cut-off point at which one says, this is the point at which it crosses a threshold. So again, I don't really understand. There was a lot that I didn't understand in the book, and a lot that I felt were logical errors. I didn't touch on happiness and his whole presentation of what he sees as happiness and human meaning, because we ran out of time, and there are other things that need to be said about the topic. Yes.
You haven't said whether we should read the book or not.
Yes.
And if I could just say, I haven't read it.
Yes.
I know somebody who did.
Yes.
And it turned them off huge.
Yeah.
So I feel as though it's a danger.
Yeah.
And can I ask your opinion? Should one not?
I think that I don't like the genre of pop academia, and I think it's a dangerous genre. And I'll tell you why. We like reading these because they're exceptionally stimulating and thought-provoking. And this book is a very stimulating and thought-provoking book. I don't think anyone can read it and think otherwise. And we like reading them because they're thought-provoking and interesting. I think there's a danger. If you read a genuinely academic work, you don't switch your mind off, and a good, rigorously written academic work, even works which are challenging to Judaism, are very clear and honest in laying out what are assumptions, what there's evidence for, what there isn't evidence for, and so on. A lot of popular academia, whether it's from Dawkins to the World, and a lot of this whole genre of big history, is seductive in how it's written. because it's presented in a guile, a very self-confident assertion that scholars believe this, science has shown that, archaeology has evidenced this, very rarely footnoted, and we read it casually, we read it as it's light reading. And it's in a form of entertainment which we think is academically rigorous, and it isn't academically rigorous. I believe a lot of what I've said in this presentation is not about religion and not about faith, and ultimately really not about faith. It's simply about academic rigor. And I would certainly say, if you want to read one of these books, Google and research every single thing that's said. And I did that to the best of my ability. I have lists of errors here, many of them trivial, of factual mistakes, which are, I guess, made in any large book, but it isn't worked through properly, and he doesn't. There's too much begging the question. There's too much of an assumption of a worldview which proves itself. If you adopt a worldview which is only bears the possibility of that which is measurable in the lab as having existence, then by definition, if your only criteria for measuring truth is science, then anything that's non-scientific will be untrue. Now, this is not a cry against science. Science is fantastic and wonderful, but there's a lot that's not science. Maths isn't science. Morality isn't science. So unless one takes a very materialistic worldview, which one wants to dismiss the whole tradition of Western thought and philosophy, never mind theology, one's in a mess with this book. And I would definitely say if someone wants to read it, they need to read it with exceptional care and rigor. If someone's interested in it, better to read the primary sources, I think, than this stuff.
You
Yeah.
mentioned that you've gone through it with
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
have picked out certain inaccuracies.
Yes.
Why hasn't anybody written a book to disprove a lot of this?
It wouldn't sell well. It'd be an enormous amount of work, and it wouldn't sell well.
Because I think a lot of it is upper
It is a big shame. I'm speaking about this book because I've seen that it has shaken many people to their core. Not everyone. Many people have actually found it very inspiring, and I don't want to overgeneralize it. For a lot of people, it's shaken them to their core, and it's uniquely dangerous because it just throws out assumptions, and it doesn't spell out that these are assumptions that are being made. If it was honest about its assumptions and spelled them out, if it was an academic work, it would be a lot less dangerous. And you sometimes have writers who are very good in their genres and very poor in other genres. Again, I'm not a biologist, but when you read someone like Dawkins, his biology, to the best of my limited ability, seems very impressive. When he comes on to philosophy, this is not a statement being made as a believer. This is a statement anyone who respects philosophy and the philosophical endeavor and the Greek and Western tradition of philosophy, what he says is poor philosophically. And people fall for it because they're not philosophically trained. And this is not about belief. A good atheist should be frustrated with what he's writing. And the damage done by this mindset is enormous because it's a nihilistic philosophy. It's a philosophy that denies the possibility of real morality and right and wrong and achievements and meaning and purpose. And these are things at the heart of what we mean to be what it means to be a human being. And the stuff scares me silly because this has the potential of destroying civilization. This is not just about Judaism and belief. This is a lot more than Judaism about belief. It's about the possibility of there being absolute truth, the possibility of us discovering anything real about the world. If you deny the possibility of absolute truth, there's no conversation to be had about anything. I'm not claiming, what's happened is in the history of Western thought, is that particularly over the last 100 years, we've become very aware of the horrors that humans are capable of inflicting on each other because of a claim to truth. And that's a real thing. Fundamentalism, religious or socialist or Nazi or whatever it may be, ideologies, political ideologies, religious ideologies do terrible damage because of this conviction of a certainty of absolute truth. Disastrous. But what we've done is we've run away so far from it that we've rejected the endeavor of trying to arrive at that which is true. Because we've become sensitive to the fact that different human beings have different viewpoints, and because we've become sensitive to the limitations, the extremes of limitation of human knowledge about so much, we've run away from the possibility of anything being absolutely true. And again, this is a self-consuming ideology, because what's really being said is there's no such thing as absolute truth, other than the truth that there's no such thing as absolute truth. That's what's being claimed. The only thing you can say with certainty, well, if there's no such thing as absolute truth, and you can have your truth, and I can have my truth, then what will you do if my truth is that there is such a thing as absolute truth? These are self-consuming philosophies, and they are not philosophically coherent, and yet we're reading them, and our children are reading them, and they're being swallowed up in this nonsense, really, and the result of it all is no possibility of anything meaningful, no possibility of absolute achievement, so go off and enjoy yourself because that's what the brain chemicals give you, and that's his definition of happiness, the right sorts of brain chemicals. The claim is so often made, and he alludes to this, though he doesn't quite spell it out. There's no reason to have any certainty about anything of morality, because you see every society differed about its morality. Simply factually incorrect. Societies have a large commonality about their morality. They differed over actually scientific facts. It's a bit like saying if you live in the 1600s and you have no way of knowing whether the moon is made of rock or cheese, there's no absolute reality about whether it's made of rock or cheese. The fact that there's no way of knowing something doesn't mean there isn't an absolute reality, and it doesn't mean we can't search to get ever closer to the truth, even if we're not capable of achieving truth with a capital T with absolute certainty. And if you look in the history of human morality, so people throw examples and say, what's about the Aztecs that did a child sacrifice? The reason the Aztecs did child sacrifice is because they believed if you didn't kill children, slaughter them on the mountaintop every day, the sun wouldn't rise. And if the sun doesn't rise, it'd be a disaster for society. They didn't think that killing children was good. They thought they had no choice. It's worth sacrificing one for the many, which is a moral decision we make the whole time. Every army makes a decision to sacrifice the one for the many. So what they're arguing about is a scientific fact. It'd be a bit like saying we're arguing over morality because people do bloodletting. Bloodletting is only an act of cruelty if you don't believe in bloodletting as an effective medicine. If you believe in this as an effective medicine, then it's not an act of cruelty. You're making a scientific mistake, not a moral mistake. If one day we would discover that the surgery that's being done currently in 2020 doesn't work and is ineffective, it wouldn't make doctors immoral. It wouldn't mean that they have different moral codes in how they operate. It would simply mean that they have a different scientific basis, factual basis, to make their moral decisions. And when you look through ancient societies, most modern day societies, share a basic set of morality. Again, this isn't a proof for the truth of morality. But the idea that somehow this is evidence for moral relativism and there's no such thing as absolute morality, again, is just part of this chipping away sadly, at the West's sense of truth and morality and meaning and purpose to life. And that to me is very scary. Yeah. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist or sociologist to know what in his upbringing and his experience as an Israeli and a Jew has affected his viewpoints. I don't know. I really can't comment on that. It's a pity that not only in my view does he make mistakes about church history and Christian history, he also makes mistakes about the classics of Jewish thought. And as I tried to present, some of his lines are simply contradicted by the very basics of the things that we believe in. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Sure.
So, one of the offshoots of his assertions about evolution and the people that human beings through evolution is that fundamentally we're just animals that perhaps have reached a greater cognitive awareness, a greater appreciation of morals, etc. When he gets to the end of the book, he discusses a little bit about how people treat animals today.
Yes.
And the way he describes their treatment as almost machines.
Yes.
Bearing in mind that if you following a theory of evolution, people and animals are basically comparable, they're just at different points in the spectrum, they're just more aware. Is there a justification to using animals in such a way? Because their lives still, our lives are their lives.
Well, this is the problem with the book, because I don't know what allows him to have a moral complaint about the crimes committed against animals when he believes that morality is simply a social construct. And I don't know how he deals with that contradiction. It's a contradiction that seems endemic through the book. He claims to be a historian, yet he preaches about values when the message, the academic message of the book, is that values are simply a social construct. So I think he's the same as all the rest of us, which is he does believe in values, and he is living a contradiction in a sense in which he can talk the talk about no absolute truth, no absolute morality, social construct, but he doesn't believe it because there are things that bother him. It's just different things that bother him to what bother other people. It's late now, so I'm going to finish with this. I'll simply say that at the conclusion of the book, he has quite interesting speculation about where things are going forward, including developments of humanity and artificial intelligence and other things like that. I would like at some stage to discuss from a hashkafa and philosophical and halachic perspective artificial intelligence and where some of these ideas may be going from. So this is a plug for my Shavuos night share, when I hope to touch upon some of these issues. It's 9:30, which is when we said we would finish, so I'm happy to stay here to take more questions, but...